Hello, children. Would you like to hear the story of the fairy who wouldn't fly? Well, come a little bit closer and I'll tell it to you. The busiest part of the forest was the glen where the fairies lived and worked. From morning until night, scores of bright, beautiful wings flashed in the sunlight as the fairies worked hard at their many tasks. They lifted up the heads of flowers after rain, helped lame beetles over bush tracks, and saved baby grubs from being eaten by ants. Everyone in Fairyland was busy. Everyone, that is, except the fairy who wouldn't fly. She spent her day hidden among the swaying blossoms, curled up in her spiderweb hammock. Occasionally she peeped rather nervously out at the other fairies, but they could never persuade her to join them as they flew among the flowers and trees. She just didn't seem to want to come outside. The Fairy Queen was quite worried about it. What could she do to get the fairy who wouldn't fly to leave her hiding place and to begin using her beautiful wings? Time and time again she tried unsuccessfully to coax the little fairy outside. At last she decided there was only one thing left to do. She would send the fairy who wouldn't fly to the wouldn't. One fine morning, a carriage arrived for the fairy who wouldn't fly. It was a faded brown autumn leaf, drawn by 2 dragonflies, escorted by 6 little russet-brown elves, mounted upon 6 shining beetles. "By order of the Queen, you are to be taken to the wouldn't," said the elves as they helped her into the carriage. "It sounds silly, but as long as I don't have to fly there," she said, as she curled herself up in the autumn leaf. Away flew the dragonflies as swift as light, with the elves following on their beetles. At last the fairy who wouldn't fly was set down at the edge of a great forest. "Where am I?" she asked, sitting up and looking around. "At the wouldn't," answered the elves. "You mean the wood, don't you?" she said crossly. "No, we mean the wouldn't," replied the elves, and away they flew. The fairy who wouldn't fly looked around rather nervously. She was all alone and a little frightened. "I wonder why the Fairy Queen has sent me here," she said to herself. All at once she was startled to hear a voice which seemed to be coming from underneath her. "Move along there, move along," it scolded in a rasping tone. The fairy looked down and realized that it was the road underneath her which was speaking. "Come along, move along. Can't be waiting all night for people like you." "You cranky thing," cried the fairy who wouldn't fly, jumping down on it with both feet as hard as she could. "There, I hope that hurts you." "Oh!" cried the road as it wrinkled up as though it were hurt. The fairy began to stroll along the road, but it wasn't very pleasant to walk on. It tried to trip her up by pushing pebbles under her feet, by suddenly making little holes in front of her, and by raising itself into bumps. "You make it so difficult for me," sobbed the fairy who wouldn't fly. "Well, why don't you fly?" the road grumbled back at her. "You have wings. Why don't you use them? I wish I could fly." At last the road was gone, rolling itself up like a long carpet. The fairy was standing all alone. She looked around at the strange place surrounding her. The trees were not growing up straight like other trees, but drooped and turned and went any way they wanted, and changed into any color they desired. There were many tracks and many beautiful colored rocks. Sitting on one of the rocks was a large green frog. "Welcome," he croaked with a smile on his face. "It's good to see such a pretty creature as you in the wouldn't." This pleased the fairy, and she felt much better. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm the frog who wouldn't hop." "And why don't you hop?" said the fairy. "Well, to tell you the truth," answered the frog, "I would rather like to. All the others seem to have so much fun, hopping all over the place, but I don't think I'd be very good at it, and they might all want to laugh at me." "I'm sure you could if you tried," said the fairy, "and you might be surprised at how good you are. Tell me, Mr. Frog, who is that sad-looking bird sitting on the branch over there. That, said the frog, is the kookaburra who wouldn't laugh. He says he feels so silly because his laugh sounds so strange, not at all pretty like the sound of the bellbird. But I like the sound of the kookaburra, said the fairy who wouldn't fly. Who is that sitting on the rock over there? That's the rabbit who wouldn't live in a burrow, replied the frog. The sun is going down, please let's go home, cried the rabbit. Very well, stop moaning, answered the frog. Where's home? Asked the fairy. In the cave round the corner. We all lived together to be friendly and so that we won't be lonely, said the kookaburra. Here we are. Here's the cave, said the kind old frog, pointing to an opening in a large rock. It's very dark, said the fairy. In fairyland we have pretty lights everywhere. I'm sorry, my dear, answered the frog, but you see, there is only one glowworm, and he's the glowworm who wouldn't glow, and it's no use asking him to shine. No use at all, cried a funny little voice from the cave. Everyone always stares at me if I start shining because I look so different. I just want to look like everyone else, like the ordinary garden worms. They don't go around shining all day long. But the earthworms don't know how to shine, said the fairy, who was really beginning to become rather cross with all these creatures who wouldn't do the things they were able to do. You could make the cave so nice for all of us if only you would let your shine start to work. Everyone, the rabbit, the kookaburra, the frog, and the fairy, crowded into the cave together, and the glowworm ordered in a very bossy voice, "Go to sleep, everyone." "Where are we to sleep?" asked the fairy. "On the floor," sighed the kookaburra. "Are there no cobweb hammocks?" The glowworm laughed loudly. "No," he said, "there's only one spider in the wouldn't, and that's the spider who wouldn't spin." "I am growing very tired of all these creatures who won't do things," cried the fairy crossly. "You must be tired of yourself too, then, miss," snapped the glowworm. All the other creatures were soon asleep. It was too stuffy inside the cave for the fairy, and she tossed and turned. At last she got up and wandered outside. The full moon shone, making it as bright as day, and everything looked lovely. Suddenly a voice called, "What are you doing out alone so late? And what are you doing here, anyhow?" The fairy looked around and saw that the voice was coming from a large flower. "Come and tell me all about fairyland, my dear," said the flower. "Oh, if only I had wings, I would love to fly there. It must be wonderful to fly over the tops of the flowers. Is it, my dear?" "I don't know," said the fairy. "You see, I'm the fairy who wouldn't fly, and I've never used my wings." "But why ever not?" said the flower. "All the other fairies fly so well," said the fairy. "And, well, I've never tried it myself because I thought that I would never be able to fly properly." "You'll never know until you try," said the flower. "I suppose not," said the fairy, "but with everyone watching." "Well, there's no one watching now except me," said the flower, "so why not have a go?" "I wonder," thought the fairy, and she looked at her wings. "I wonder if I can open them." She tried. It was very hard at first, but with an effort her wings slowly unfolded. "Oh," she cried aloud, "I didn't know they were so shimmery and glimmering." "They look beautiful," said the flower. "See if you can fly with them." "Oh, I don't know," said the fairy. "I don't think I really could. What if I fail?" "If you can't, you can't," said the flower. "But until you try, you will never know." And so the fairy decided that she would try. She decided to climb up onto a very high rock nearby and try flying down from there. When she looked down, the earth beneath her seemed a very long way away indeed. She shut her eyes tightly, moved her shoulders, and jumped. At first she felt herself falling through the air, and then her wings began to open and shut as if they knew the way to fly all the time. The fairy floated like a piece of thistledown onto the grass. First she laughed, and then she cried. Then she jumped up and down and leapt into the air. Then she talked to her wings and stroked them, then flew up into the air once more. At last she became so tired she fell fast asleep, lying across the top of a toadstool, her lovely wings still quivering. When she awoke, she felt as happy as she had ever felt in her whole life. As she sat up on her toadstool looking around, she suddenly heard the rustling of leaves close by. She turned to find a small human child, dressed in a cosy pair of flannel pajamas, sitting upon the grass, quietly sucking his thumb and whimpering softly. Tears were running down his cheeks. But he stopped crying for a moment as he noticed the fairy. She was excited because it was the first time she had seen a human so closely, and she flew around him in a ring. He tried to catch her in his chubby hands, but missed her every time. When he couldn't catch her, he began to cry once more. The sound of the little boy's crying brought all the other creatures hurrying to see what the noise was about. "Why are you making that dreadful noise?" demanded the glowworm. "I want to go home," cried the little boy, and his sobbing grew louder. The noise frightened the rabbit who wouldn't live in a burrow. He ran off and began to dig, and before very long there was only his little white bob of a tail showing, and by there wasn't even that. He had made a burrow the way his mother had always shown him, and had gone to live in a cosy little house underground. "Something must be done," said the kind frog. "We can't have the little boy crying like that." Suddenly he gave a hop into the air. Such a funny hop, and then another one. The kookaburra looked at him in surprise and began to laugh. "Ha, ha!" he laughed, almost falling from the branch of the tree. The child looked up in surprise and clapped his hands. So the frog did it again. Every time he hopped, the kookaburra laughed, and when the kookaburra laughed, the little boy laughed. "That's wonderful," said the fairy in delight. "He isn't crying any more." "It's a funny thing," said the frog as he stopped for breath. "I like hopping, and I don't feel silly. And I don't mind laughing any more," said the kookaburra. "In fact, I rather like the sound of it. Ha, 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 ha!" And he laughed again. "Now there is no need for us to stay any longer in the wooden," said the frog. "But I can't remember how to get out of here." "I know the way, I'm sure," said the fairy, laughing and dancing around on the grass. "My wings would know the way. I've learned how to use them now. I can fly out of the wooden, and you can follow." They all stared at her in surprise. "Look," she cried happily, and she showed them. She flew up above the flowers and fluttered around over their heads. "Your wings are very beautiful indeed," said the frog. "Let's go," said the kookaburra. "It's already past midday, and we'll have to go slowly because the little boy will be with us. We will try to find his home on the way." And so they set out together, taking the small child with them. They had not gone very far before it began to get dark. They decided to make a shelter for themselves under some rocks. The kookaburra and the frog and the glowworm sat down together with the little boy, while the fairy went off in search of food. The boy sat and chuckled as the kookaburra and frog amused him. Soon the fairy returned, bringing with her wild berries to eat and water in a fairy cup to drink. They enjoyed the food together, but as it grew darker, the little boy became frightened once more, and he was no longer amused by the antics of the frog and the kookaburra. "Oh dear," said the fairy, "I wonder what we can do to stop him crying." Suddenly he stopped crying, and at the same moment the fairy noticed that the forest around them was no longer dark. A soft glow fell over the rocks and trees. She looked over to where the light seemed to be coming from, and there, sitting on a rock, was the glowworm, shining as bright as could be. Everyone yelled with glee. "What a lovely soft light you give," said the kookaburra, and the glowworm grinned proudly. "Now you can all go to sleep," said the glowworm, "and I will keep a light for you and look after you in this strange place." As they settled down for the night, the fairy began to sing a lullaby to put the little boy to sleep. Soon he was fast asleep, and so was everyone else except the fairy, who lay awake for a while, wondering how they were going to find the little boy's home. Wake up, cried a rough, roady voice early next morning. The road had come twisting and winding right off his tracks through the trees to where they were all snuggled together. What are you doing away right out here? Said the fairy. It seems a long way from your usual way. Well, said the road, I'm looking for a little human boy who wandered away from me and got lost. I don't suppose you've seen him, have you? He's over here, tucked away, fast asleep, replied the fairy. Oh, thank goodness, said the road. I've been looking for him everywhere to take him back to his home. His mother has been missing him. Well, let's all go and find her, said the fairy. They climbed onto the road and off they went. They had not gone very far before they came to a small white and green cottage. This is where the little boy lives, said the road. See, his mother at the gate, looking for him. As they passed the cottage, they pushed the little boy gently off the road, and the last they saw of him, his mother had picked him up and was hugging him closely to her. When they had gone some distance further with the road, the fairy noticed a speck in the sky which came nearer and nearer and grew larger and larger as she watched. As it came closer, she saw that it was a carriage, a large blue water lily, drawn by the loveliest bunch of coloured butterflies she had ever seen. Driving it was an elf with a merry face. The carriage stopped next to them, and the elf spoke. The Fairy Queen has sent a special carriage for you, he said, bowing to the fairy. She has heard that you have begun to use your wings at last, and that you and these other creatures have helped a small child to find his way home to his mother. She is anxious to see you and to meet your friends. The fairy and all of her friends except the kookaburra climbed into the carriage. Off they went with the kookaburra flying along behind. Oh, the laughter and the joy when they reached fairyland! The other fairies ran to meet them, and everyone hugged and kissed the fairy and all of her friends. The little fairy opened her wings and flew out of the carriage and up over the heads of all the other fairies. As she alighted on the ground once more, a smart young elf came up to her and said, Her Majesty the Fairy Queen would like to see you and your companions at once. He took the fairy by the hand and led her to a quiet corner where the Fairy Queen sat on her throne. Well, said the Queen, I am glad you are using your wings at last. Yes, said the fairy, it's wonderful. I can't imagine why it took me so long to begin to fly. Never mind, said the Queen, you have learnt now. How sad it would be not to learn to use such lovely wings. And these, I take it, are your friends. Yes, said the fairy. This is the frog who has learnt that it is fun to hop, and the kookaburra who has learnt to enjoy his own laughing. And here is the glowworm who has discovered how helpful he can be when he lets his light shine out for everyone. I hear that while you were in the woodland, you not only learnt to do so many things, but you also helped a little human boy to find his way home. I was very pleased about this, said the Queen. Your friends are welcome to make their home here in Fairyland. I'm so glad, said the fairy, sighing with joy. I have decided to give you a new name, said the Queen, turning to the fairy once more. From now on, you will no longer be called the fairy who wouldn't fly, but instead you will be named Fairy Fleetwing. Perhaps some day, if you do not grow tired of watching, you may see a flash of sunlight, and there will be a fairy sitting on one of your roses in her rose-petal frock. But you'll have to be very careful not to say, Why, that's the fairy who wouldn't fly, because she is very, very proud of her new name and does not like to think of herself as the fairy who wouldn't fly.